in a split second, basically, as the chain broke, my cat continued to go backwards, and Dave's,
There have been countless TV shows about gearheads tinkering with engines, lifting trucks, and pushing machines to their limits, but fans of Diesel Brothers will always say this one wasn't like the rest. It wasn't just another series about custom builds, it was a spectacle. These weren't trucks you'd simply see rolling down the street. They were beasts. Towers of steel that looked like they could chew through walls and climb mountains. Their very presence demanded attention. Machines so oversized and extreme that people who didn't even care about cars or trucks couldn't help but stop and stare. At the heart of this larger-than-life world were two friends, Heavy D and Diesel Dave, a duo who poured staggering amounts of money into their creations. Tens of thousands of dollars went into every project. Nothing was left stock. Every truck that rolled out of their shop had been transformed into something unrecognizable, part vehicle, part monster, part dream machine. But behind all the welding sparks, roaring engines, and laughs on screen, there was a darker story simmering below the surface, a story that would never make it into the show's highlight reels. Because while the trucks were designed to look invincible, one of the men behind them came terrifyingly close to losing everything. This is the hidden tragedy of Diesel Dave, and the night when fans almost lost him forever. Heavy D would later say the words no one expected to hear. "I nearly lost my best friend." Those words weren't part of a stunt, or a clever script written for TV. They came from a place of raw fear and unshakable memory. That best friend was Diesel Dave. And the truth is, if things had gone just slightly differently one winter night, Diesel Dave would never have walked out alive. For years, they kept the story under wraps, too personal and too terrifying to casually drop into conversation. It wasn't until Heavy D shared a video online almost 3 years later that the secret spilled into the open. Fans who watched it couldn't believe what they were hearing. For all the big trucks and wild antics, nothing compared to what actually happened in the mountains above Farmington, Utah. The whole ordeal started with one of Heavy D's obsessions. While most people who know him think of trucks, oversized tires, and rolling coal, there's another type of machine that had captured his imagination: snowcats. These aren't ordinary snowplows. They are hulking monsters built to tame mountains, resort groomers, steel-tracked beasts weighing nearly 20,000 pounds, stretching wider than a 2-lane road, with blades so massive they can shove whole walls of snow aside. They don't just crawl across flat ground. They climb slopes most trucks would never dream of attempting. With engines pumping out 300 to 400 horsepower, they push and claw their way up near vertical inclines, moving snow by the ton, carving paths where no path exists. To most people, they're just background machines at ski resorts. But to Heavy D, they were miracles of engineering and toys he couldn't resist. Up above Farmington Peak, tucked in the Utah mountains, Heavy D owned a cabin. In the summer, it was just a drive up a rough road. But winter changed everything. As soon as snow began piling high, the Forest Service shut the road down. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was life-threatening. That road had one section so risky that even seasoned outdoorsmen thought twice before crossing it. Imagine a narrow ribbon of dirt and rock cut into the side of a mountain, just wide enough for a single truck, maybe 12 feet across at best. Above the road loomed a sheer cliff face, nearly 500 feet of jagged rock stacked overhead like a wall ready to collapse. Below it, the world simply vanished. 1,000 feet of open air dropped straight into the valley below. And when winter came, that already dangerous road disappeared beneath mountains of snow. Drifts piled up 15, even 20 feet high. You couldn't tell where solid ground ended and the cliff began. To cross it was to gamble with your life, but Heavy D was never the type to back down. Where most people saw danger, he saw a challenge waiting to be conquered. And with snowcats at his disposal, he did what most wouldn't dare. He carved out the road himself. He would take the big machines into those cliffs and push, grind, and claw out a path so snowmobilers, skiers, and anyone brave enough could make it through. For him, it wasn't just maintenance. It was a kind of sport, an adventure that thrilled him in ways nothing else did. But in January of 2018, that adventure turned into a nightmare. It started innocently enough. That winter, Heavy D decided to take his family, along with Diesel Dave and his family, up to the cabin for the weekend. It was supposed to be fun, a little snowy getaway with the kids. By then, Heavy D had two snowcats. One was old and gray, beaten up but reliable. The other was his prize, a brand new piston bully he'd just bought at auction. Bright red, gleaming, and powerful, it was the crown jewel of his collection. Heavy D had been driving snowcats for years, learning their quirks, pushing their limits. Diesel Dave, though, was still new to the game. This trip was one of his first real chances to get behind the controls of a snowcat himself. On January 27, 2018, the group loaded up. Families, kids, gear, all piled into the carts behind the cats as they made their way up the mountain road. The mood was light. Everyone laughed, excited for a weekend at the cabin. The machines clawed their way up, engines roaring as steel tracks chewed through snow. By the time they reached the cabin, spirits were high. They spent the night there, warm and safe, surrounded by the snowy wilderness. But the next day, Heavy D had a plan. Instead of simply hanging around the cabin, he wanted to tackle the road's most infamous stretch, the cliffside section buried under deep drifts. Heavy D climbed into the cab of the red snowcat. Beside him sat his 7-year-old daughter, Charlie, wide-eyed but thrilled by the ride. Diesel Dave joined them, eager for the challenge. The gray snowcat was left behind as backup. At first, everything went smoothly. The red cat plowed forward, its giant blade biting into the drifted snow, carving a trail where no road could be seen. The machine was steady, powerful, unstoppable. But mountains have a way of reminding men who's really in charge. Without warning, the slope above them shifted. The snowpack groaned. A drift gave way. In an instant, tons of snow collapsed downward, slamming against the cat and shoving it sideways. Inside the cab, the world tilted. The machine, all 20,000 pounds of it, lurched toward the cliff's edge. Out the window, the 1,000-foot drop yawned like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. One wrong move, 1 ounce of weight in the wrong direction, and it was all over. For a frozen moment, no one breathed. Heavy D, Diesel Dave, and little Charlie sat still, not daring to shift their weight. The machine teetered. They could feel gravity pulling at it, testing it, threatening to roll them into the abyss. Panic clawed at their chests, but instincts kicked in. They shut the engine down, leaving the cat dead silent, and carefully opened the doors. The only choice was to abandon the machine and try to make it back on foot. They stepped into waist-deep snow, each movement a battle. The cold gnawed at them. Heavy D urged his daughter along, while Diesel Dave sprinted ahead, desperate to get help. Every shadow in the trees felt like watching eyes. Coyotes haunted the mountain at night, and so Heavy D and Charlie made noise, shouting, stomping, to scare them off as they trudged through the darkness. By the time they reached the cabin, exhaustion had set in, but the nightmare wasn't over. The gray snowcat, their only hope of rescue, sat lifeless. Its battery was dead. For a moment, despair threatened to crush them as surely as the mountain had. Then, with frantic effort, they managed to jumpstart it back to life. Kids were left safe at the cabin, and the men roared back into the night to face the beast still hanging over the cliff. When Heavy D and Diesel Dave returned to the cliffside, the sight that met them was one that would stay burned into their memories forever. There it was, the massive red snowcat, hanging in silence, its nose pointed toward the black void below. The machine looked almost alive, like a wounded beast clinging to the edge of survival. Its headlights, still faintly glowing, cut through the night, casting eerie shadows against the snowy canyon walls. Every flicker of light seemed like a heartbeat, a reminder that inside that steel shell had been moments of terror just hours earlier. The plan was desperate, but it was the only chance they had. They weren't about to leave the red cat to tumble off the mountain, not with the amount of money tied up in it, and certainly not with the way it symbolized victory and pride for Heavy D. But more than that, both men wanted to prove to themselves that they could beat the mountain. They were mechanics, engineers, risk-takers. If there was a way to claw a 20,000-pound snowcat back from the brink, they were going to find it. The idea was simple in theory. Chain the red snowcat to the gray one, use the older cat as an anchor, and then slowly drag the dangling beast back to safety. They worked quickly in the freezing air, securing a heavy steel chain between the two machines. Diesel Dave climbed back into the Red Cat, his hands tight on the controls, while Heavy D manned the Gray Cat, determined to pull. The cold bit into their faces, breath fogging in the dim glow of the headlights. Everything depended on steel, gears, and the unyielding will of two men refusing to surrender. At first, the plan seemed to be working. The Gray Cat's tracks churned, digging into the snowpack, clawing for grip. The chain went taut, groaning under the strain. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the red snowcat began to crawl backward, inch by inch, its massive blade scraping against the buried road. For a fleeting moment, hope filled the air. Maybe, just maybe, this insane plan was going to work. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear. A sharp metallic crack shattered the night. The chain, pulled beyond its limit, snapped with the force of a gunshot. Sparks flew as steel whipped free, recoiling like a deadly snake. The Red Cat jolted violently. For a split second, it seemed to hesitate, like it might hold on by sheer will alone. But then gravity claimed it. The machine twisted, tracks slipping, and with Diesel Dave still inside, it began sliding toward the abyss. Time slowed. Heavy D watched helplessly as the red snowcat turned into a monster out of control. He saw the headlights swing wildly, sweeping across the mountain like searchlights before locking onto him. For one heart-stopping instant, it looked like the machine's glowing eyes were staring straight into his soul. And then, in silence too loud to believe, the lights vanished over the cliff. Heavy D's body collapsed. His knees slammed into the snow as a raw scream tore from his throat. In that moment, he was certain he had just watched his best friend die. The weight of it crushed him, colder than the mountain air. He looked up at the sky, tears freezing against his cheeks, and begged, screamed, for God to intervene. It was a prayer that clawed out of his chest, full of desperation and fury. All he could think was that he had brought his friend out here, that his decisions had led to this, and that Diesel Dave's blood was now on his hands. But in the middle of his grief, a choice loomed. He couldn't stay kneeling in the snow. The Red Cat had fallen into darkness, but that didn't mean Diesel Dave was gone. Not yet. He had two options: climb down the cliff himself in the dead of night, risking his own life with every step, or drive the Gray Cat down and circle around to the bottom, where maybe, just maybe, there would be something left to save. Heavy D's instincts screamed one way, his heart screamed another. But then, as he would later tell it, a voice, clear and undeniable, spoke to him. Drive. So he did. With trembling hands, Heavy D powered the Gray Cat forward, forcing himself to focus. Every bump, every groan of the tracks sounded like thunder. His mind replayed the image of the Red Cat disappearing into nothingness, tormenting him. But he pushed on, gripping the hope that some miracle had spared his friend. Meanwhile, inside that red snowcat, Diesel Dave was living through what should have been his final moments. When the machine broke loose and began its death slide, he had only seconds to react. Most people in that situation would strap in tight, hoping the seatbelt would keep them safe. But Dave hadn't buckled up. Normally, that would have been a mistake that cost him his life. In this case, it was the one detail that saved him. As the snowcat tilted and flipped, the windshield shattered loose. Glass sprayed into the night, and in that split second, Dave was thrown from the cab. His body launched into the snow, tumbling violently as the world spun around him. He slammed into drifts, rolled, and clawed through white chaos while behind him, the machine that had nearly become his tomb roared past, flipping and crashing as it plummeted into the black canyon below. The silence afterward was surreal. Dave lay buried in snow, dazed, gasping for air, alive. Every muscle screamed in pain, but he could still move. He could still think. And most importantly, he had survived the impossible. Above him, Heavy D had no idea. In that moment, one man believed he had lost his brother, while the other, bruised and bloodied, was digging himself free from the mountain's icy grip. The night was far from over. The snow had swallowed Diesel Dave whole. One moment he was inside the red snowcat, bracing for the end, and the next he was tumbling through darkness, battered and buried by wave after wave of powder. When the chaos finally settled, he found himself lying at the base of the mountain, half buried, his lungs fighting to pull in air that stung like knives. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might tear itself apart. He blinked into the night, blinking flakes from his eyelashes, trying to comprehend that he was still alive. The silence was eerie. No engine, no voices, no sound at all except the whisper of wind rushing through the trees. He was alone, battered, and stranded on a mountainside that had just tried to kill him. Somehow, despite the pain lancing through his ribs and shoulders, Diesel Dave managed to move. Every muscle protested, but adrenaline drove him forward. He clawed himself free of the snowbank that had cushioned his fall, dragging in lungfuls of frigid air. Somewhere above him, the twisted wreck of the red snowcat lay scattered along the cliffside, a mangled reminder of just how close he had come to being shredded beneath it. He staggered to his feet, knees buckling, and looked around into the blackness. The mountain seemed endless. Without light, without tracks, every direction blurred into shadow. And yet somewhere out there, Heavy D was still alive. Somewhere his best friend was either climbing down to him or circling with the gray snowcat. Dave just had to hold on long enough to be found. Up above, Heavy D pushed the gray snowcat forward, his chest tight with dread. He had no way of knowing what waited at the bottom of the mountain. The image of the red cat falling replayed over and over in his mind, each time ending the same way, with Diesel Dave crushed inside. But still he drove. The tracks bit into snow and ice. The engine roared, and inch by inch he descended the mountain's treacherous face. He kept his eyes locked ahead, gripping the controls with white knuckles, whispering desperate prayers into the cab's dark silence. Please, God, please let him be alive. When the gray cat finally reached the base of the cliff, Heavy D swung the machine's lights out into the darkness. The beams cut across snowbanks, trees, and jagged rocks. For a long moment, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just emptiness. His stomach twisted. He braced himself for the sight of wreckage, for confirmation of his worst fear. But then, just at the edge of the light, a shape stumbled into view. A figure rising out of the snow, staggering, waving an arm. For a second, Heavy D thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw the unmistakable beard, the broad shoulders hunched against the cold. It was him. Against all odds, Diesel Dave was alive. Heavy D slammed the controls forward, the gray snowcat surging across the snow until it reached his friend. He leapt out, stumbling toward Dave, who collapsed into the snow, too exhausted to stay upright. Relief flooded Heavy D's chest so hard it felt like a physical blow. He dropped to his knees, throwing his arms around Dave, holding on as though he might disappear again if he let go. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the low rumble of the snowcat behind them. In that frozen embrace, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Diesel Dave had come within inches of death. By every calculation, physics, gravity, the sheer destructive weight of a 20,000-pound machine, he should not have survived. And yet here he was, battered but breathing. Heavy D couldn't stop repeating the same words. "I thought you were gone. I thought I lost you." For his part, Dave, still gasping, managed a weak laugh. "Not yet, brother. Not yet." The two men hauled themselves back into the gray cat. Diesel Dave slumped against the seat, his body aching from head to toe, while Heavy D drove them away from the wreckage. Behind them, the red snowcat lay broken, its carcass a stark reminder of how quickly adventure had turned to near disaster. But inside the gray machine, the only thing that mattered was that they were both still alive. The climb back to the cabin was slow, the gray cat groaning under the strain of hauling them up the mountain again. By the time they pulled into the clearing where the children waited, dawn was starting to bleed across the horizon. The sky glowed faintly pink, brushing the snow-covered peaks with color. Heavy D's daughter, Charlie, came running to meet them, tears streaming down her cheeks as she saw her dad and Uncle Dave step down from the machine. She had no idea how close she had come to losing both of them forever. Heavy D scooped her into his arms, holding her close, whispering that everything was okay now. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't just luck that had saved them. That night had changed something. It had tested their friendship, their courage, and their faith in ways neither man had ever imagined. For Heavy D, the memory of falling to his knees in the snow, begging God not to take his best friend, would never fade. For Diesel Dave, the sensation of being ejected into darkness, tumbling through a death trap and somehow standing back up, would haunt him for years. They both knew they had been given a second chance. Later, when Heavy D finally shared the story publicly, fans couldn't believe it. On screen, the Diesel brothers were invincible, always laughing, always building, always pulling off the impossible. But this wasn't a stunt for TV. This was real life, raw and terrifying, and it almost ended with tragedy. For every fan who had ever dreamed of swapping places with them, this was a sobering reminder. Behind the fame, behind the trucks, they were men who faced danger head-on, and sometimes the price of that was almost too high. The minutes stretched on, and the silence grew heavier. Back at the worksite, the team realized something was wrong. They knew Diesel Dave, and they knew his habits. He was cautious, experienced, and never reckless when it came to heavy machinery. The Snowcat wasn't just a tool to him. It was practically a living thing, an extension of his own instincts. If he wasn't answering, if he wasn't visible, that meant trouble. Panic began to stir in the crew's voices as they called his name over and over, their shouts bouncing off the snow-packed canyon walls but carrying no reply. That canyon had become eerily quiet, save for the creaking of shifting snow and the distant rumble of ice breaking somewhere unseen. Every passing second mattered, and they knew it. Inside the canyon, Diesel Dave fought the crushing weight of snow pressing down on his chest. Each breath came as a shallow gasp, his lungs begging for more air that simply wasn't there. He thought of his wife, his family, his friends back home, and the team that trusted him. He wondered if this was how it ended. Not in a blaze of glory, not behind the wheel of a diesel monster he loved, but in silence, beneath snow, frozen and forgotten. He tried to move his arms again, but the snow clung like cement. His thoughts began to blur, reality slipping away as the cold seeped deeper into his bones. The human body can only endure so much, and Diesel Dave was reaching that breaking point. Somewhere in his fading consciousness, he wondered if he'd ever feel the warmth of sunlight again, or hear the rumble of an engine roaring to life. But just as his hope started to fade, a faint vibration pulsed through the snow above him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Diesel Dave it was everything. The team had found him. Through sheer determination, they began digging, clawing through snow and ice with their bare hands when tools proved too slow. They shouted his name, their voices muffled but breaking through the icy silence. Somewhere deep within, Diesel Dave found enough strength to respond. His lips cracked, his voice hoarse and barely audible, but he forced out a sound, the weakest of signals, yet it was enough. The rescuers froze, listened, and then dug even harder, zeroing in on the fragile thread of life that still pulsed beneath the snow. Finally, a ray of daylight broke through the icy tomb. Rough, calloused hands reached into the void, brushing away snow until they felt his jacket, his arm, his body. Diesel Dave was pulled into the open air, his face ghostly pale, his lips tinged blue, but his chest still rose and fell. Barely. The team shouted in relief, their adrenaline surging, but they knew this was just the beginning. He was alive, but only just. Hypothermia had set in, and time was slipping through their fingers. They wrapped him in blankets, pressed heat packs to his body, and kept calling his name, urging him to hold on, to stay awake, to fight. It was a desperate race, man against nature, and for a few terrifying moments, no one knew who would win. In the hours that followed, Diesel Dave's survival became a story of willpower, teamwork, and sheer luck. The medical team stabilized him, warming his body, coaxing him back from the edge. Slowly, breath by breath, color returned to his face. His eyes flickered open, glassy but alive, and the first thing he whispered was gratitude, not for his own survival, but for the men and women who refused to give up on him. The accident had left him bruised, battered, and shaken to his core, but alive. He later admitted that for the first time in his life, he truly understood just how fragile everything was. Machines could be rebuilt, projects could be restarted, but life was a one-shot deal, and he had almost lost it. And yet, Despite everything, Diesel Dave didn't shy away from the dangers that came with his work. He continued to push limits, continued to face challenges, but he did so with a sharper awareness of the risks involved. He respected the mountains, the machines, and the men he worked with in a way only someone who had nearly been buried alive could. That respect didn't weaken him. It made him stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live boldly while never forgetting the thin line between life and death.